Welcome. We are Sofia Martinez-Mannen and
Viviana Bruno.
And today we will be talking about the life and legacy of Chicana writer and activist Cherri Moraga. Before we get into the life and work of Cherri Moraga, it is important that we explain some of the language that we will be using throughout the podcast. Cherri self-identifies as Chicana, written with an X at the beginning to denote that it is derived from the word Mexicana, and because the X is, in itself, an act of subverting the normative ideologies that generally coincide with the word Chicana in its common spelling with a CH at the beginning. When referring to Cherri, that is the word that we will use, Chicana with an X. But when we are referring to the general population from Latin America and their descendants, we will use the terms Chicane and Latine because they allow for gender neutrality when Chicano and Latino do not. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about Moraga's life.
Cherri Moraga is a celebrated Chicana poet, playwright, and activist who was born in Southern California in 1952 to parents Joseph Lawrence and Elvira Moraga. Both of her parents were from California, but her mother was the child of Mexican immigrants and her father was white. She has two older siblings, a brother and a sister, James and Joanne, who she was quite close to growing up because they were all born within a couple years of one another.
Cherri's given name was Cherri Lawrence, but as she explains in a 2005 interview with Kelly Anderson, Lawrence wasn't a family name because her father was adopted and it was his adoptive name, and so she chose to go by her mother's name Moraga when she began publishing her writing. Growing up, Moraga dealt with the struggle of identifying strongly with her Mexican heritage and her mother's culture, while passing as white and not being seen as legitimately Chicana. It can be a very damaging experience for a young person to not have their identity validated by their surroundings or how people perceive them. Cherri felt every bit as Mexican as the rest of her family, but because she didn't look it, she wasn't accepted fully by other Chicana Latina people.
Her mother grew up in Southern California, and her family moved back and forth between Mexico and California as work necessitated. Because of this, her education was inconsistent and she was only able to receive a third-grade education. Moraga's mother and her mother's mother were very strong women who led their families after the men could no longer work and provide. She credits this time she spent with her mother and the women on her mother's side of the family for shaping her into the storyteller that she is.
Moraga was raised in a Mexican household, which came with the strong themes of machismo and sexism that are often perpetuated by those who have been oppressed. When she was a child, Moraga describes herself as a tomboy and a free spirit that wasn't placed into a small box by her parents. That all changed when she was about 12 and began to be seen as more of a woman by her parents. The expectations that were set by her mother were very limiting and held her to a strict stereotypical gender role. This became especially challenging as Moraga wrestled with her lesbian identity, as it directly contradicted the expectations that had been set for her. The result was Moraga's rejection of those stereotyped roles and a strong dedication to speaking to the importance of knowing and honoring oneself. Despite the at times tense relationship between Moraga and her mother growing up, Moraga attributes much of her success and self-conception to her mother. In a poem published in her book Loving in the War Years, Moraga writes about how her mother's education and relationship to language impacted her and was passed on. The poem goes as follows. It's the poverty. I lack imagination, you say. No, I lack language. The language to clarify my resistance to the literate. Words are a war to me. They threaten my family. To gain the word to describe the loss, I risk losing everything. I may create a monster, the word's length and body swelling up colorful and thrilling, looming over my mother, characterized. Her voice in the distance, unintelligible, illiterate. These are the monster's words.
This poem illustrates how language, voice, and literacy are deeply intertwined with Chicana Latina identity. our language and our ability to wield it in ways that are not deemed appropriate are consistently policed in this country. Either you are not proficient enough in English, or you speak with an accent and can't assimilate appropriately, or you don't have a strong connection to Spanish and you've lost part of what people say makes you truly Chicana Latina and can no longer validly claim that identity. Of course, both of these things are untrue, which is why Moraga takes the time to speak on them and to point out how hypocritical and unfair they are. Moraga encourages all Chicana Latina people to embrace who they are and feel secure in their self-conception and identity.
From an early age, she noted that her brown-skinned Mexican classmates and even her slightly darker-skinned sister were treated as less intelligent and worthy of education than she was, simply because she was light-skinned. That inequitable treatment spurred Moraga's interest in social justice and equity work. Moraga knew that she did not experience oppression on the basis of race or color, but what connected her to the experiences of women of color was her lesbian identity. Growing up in the 50s and 60s, being lesbian was not something that was spoken out loud, especially within Black, Indigenous communities of color, including her own family. In the 70s and 80s, she received her Bachelor's of Arts in English in 1974 from Immaculate Heart College and her Master's of Arts in Feminist Writings in 1980 from San Francisco State University. Moraga began writing about being a Chicana lesbian, something that not many people were willing to do at the time. This is when she began going by Moraga instead of Lawrence, which was her father's adopted last name. She worked closely with fellow lesbian Chicana activists and poet Gloria Anzaldúa, and the two of them wrote and co-edited This Bridge Called My Back and Loving in the War Years, two anthologies in which lesbian Chicana theory and experience are the central themes.
This Bridge Called My Back was adapted into Spanish, which was then named Esta Puente Mi Espalda, Voces de Mujeres Tercermundistas en los Estados Unidos. This anthology included radical women of color's voices, such as Ana Castillo and Norma Alarcón. These writings called for greater prominence of race-related subjectivities within feminism, which helped lay the foundation for third-wave feminism. She wrote the books Chicana Codex of Changing Consciousness, Writings 2000 to 2010, Waiting in the Wings, Portrait of a Queer Motherhood, and Loving in the War Years, Lo que nunca pasó por sus labios, all of which draw from her personal experiences and of the experiences of her family and friends. She has also written several works of drama, including The Mathematics of Love, Watsonville/Circle in the Dark, Hungry Women, and Heroes and Saints, and other plays. In 2019, she was awarded with the Bernard Medal of Distinction from Bernard College for her work as a writer throughout her lifetime.
Moraga's work, while not entirely mainstream because it does not fit within the confines of dominant white culture, was extremely influential in helping bridge the divide between third-wave white feminists and Chicana women, all while pulling in LGBTQ people. For Moraga, the important factor wasn't that any one identity was more oppressed than the other, but that each was specific and could compound. In other words, identities are intersectional, and people shouldn't be reduced to any one thing that identifies them. This theory came about around the same time that Kimberly Crenshaw coined the word intersectionality as it related to the intersecting identities and obstacles that are faced by Black, Indigenous people of color. More specifically, this term was originally coined within a legal context, but has now gained popular use more broadly when talking about identity. In her 1979 essay, La Güera, Moraga writes about the importance of understanding the specificity of oppression. Moraga quotes herself in an interview with Las Maestras Center in March of 2021, reading a few important lines from La Huera. The whole quote from the essay goes, "In this country, lesbianism is a poverty, as is being brown, as is being a woman, as is being just plain poor. The danger lies in ranking the oppressions. The danger lies in failing to acknowledge the specificity of the oppression. The danger lies in attempting to deal with oppression from a purely theoretical base, without an emotional, heartfelt grappling with the source of our own oppression, without naming the enemy within ourselves and outside of us. No authentic, non-hierarchical connection among oppressed groups can take place." This essay came early in her career, but this sentiment never went away or changed. Failing to acknowledge the experiences of others is dangerous and puts them at risk of being further oppressed or marginalized.
One of the compelling elements of Moraga's work is her discussion of what it means to be Chicane or Latina. She, along with her collaborators and contemporaries, points out that being Chicane or Latina is to be inherently mixed. The racial makeup of Chicane Latina people is not monolithic. That is to say that not every Chicane Latina person has the same race. Moreover, Moraga explains that most Chicane Latina people are descended from, to some degree, indigenous, Spanish, and African people. That is not to say that there aren't Latinas of different races, but these are the main racial backgrounds that contribute to Latina mestizaje or mixed race.
Moraga does not suggest that as Chicanes, Latinas, we should claim a racial identity that is not our own, only that we must know where we come from in order to understand the generational wealth and trauma that we bring with us into the present. The greatest impact Cherri Moraga has had is empowering other Chicane Latina people, queer people in particular, to embrace their identities and feel joy and pride in them. For many years, there was no space for Latina people who didn't fit into the stereotype of what it means to be Latina, especially here in the United States. And people like Cherri Moraga went out on a limb to provide that space so that Latina people could be their true selves. She continues to impact the lives of young artists as an English professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, where her long-term partner, Celia Hernandez Rodriguez, runs Las Maestras, Center for Chicana Indigenous Thought and Art Practice. Cherri and Celia have a son, Rafael, and continue to be each other's artistic partners in addition to life partners. It is important for us to recognize the people that contributed and continue to contribute to the battle for our liberation. As young Latinas, Viviana and I owe a lot to people like Cherri Moraga, Kimberly Crenshaw, Gloria Anzaldúa, Tarana Burke, and countless other Black, Indigenous people of color, women of color in particular, who have laid down the groundwork for us to have the liberties and awarenesses that we do. These activists aren't as well known as others, but their impact is still profound and enduring. It is our job to take what they've given us and continue working towards the goal of a world without institutionalized oppression holding us back. We hope you enjoyed learning a little about Cherri Moraga, her life, her work, and her continued legacy, as well as learning a bit about what it means to be a Chicana and a woman of color, especially here in the United States, and how important it is to be an activist that speaks out for yourself and others now and always. Thank you.